dude, I feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
All right, so we got the pleasure sitting down with my man Rick today over at Clemson. Me and Rick been really close friends for a couple years now. You know, since I got close first with Monty Lee, and then when I got over there, I was like, you know, me and Rick started chopping it up. And you know, again, I've leaned on Rick. We've done some consulting with Rick, where you know he's really poured into us and some of the ways that we view the body, and has been a major resource for us. So I just definitely I'm excited to sit down and actually get on. I was thinking the other day, I'm like, how do we not have a podcast yet? Like this is crazy. We talk all the time. I don't know how we don't got a podcast yet. So Rick, yeah, why don't you give everybody like a background of who you are, you know, like your background, and also kind of what you do over at Clemson.
Yeah, sure. Appreciate you having me on here, Joe. I guess finally, huh?
No, right?
So Rick Franzblau, I've been at Clemson 18 years now. Been a long time. Grew up in Rochester, New York. Played mainly football, baseball, football in college. Career kind of ended early with injuries. So it was kind of motivating factor me kind of getting into the performance world. So that started by the time I was like a sophomore, junior in college. And then I graduated, looking in place for intern, started at Clemson, and I worked through, I've been six different positions since I've been there. Now I'm assistant AD over Olympic sports performance, to oversee all of our Olympic sports performance and sports science departments. So you know, I worked in football, all different Olympic sports, and in the last couple of years, still have the position of oversight these departments, but as a daily practitioner. It's like probably 3 years now, maybe a little longer, just working with baseball, which I think has actually been helpful in my career. Just having the background working so many different sports and settings kind of helped as I've kind of finally narrowed this funnel down kind of just to baseball. I think that helped me become a better generalist. And you know, obviously working with a lot of people in the baseball industry, that's something I highly recommend for young practitioners is not getting into at least from a performance perspective, getting into the rabbit hole just baseball too early.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also wanted you to kind of highlight too as well. I know that we've talked about there's been some big, you know, mentors and also different stages where you've kind of changed how you've thought about the strength side. And we've really talked about those like over the years. And one thing I've always really admired from the other side of that is like you have such a focus on the field, and you kind of work backwards. And we've discussed this kind of off air before we started recording, but like, you know, again, you have a different way of looking about how you view the weight room comparatively to a lot of traditional strength coaches, and like how, and again, the reason I want to talk about this too is like this is foundational for you that then changes so many different ways about how you go about programming, about how you view skill, how we view adaptations and what we're actually trying to do in the gym, and then also to how it actually changes, in my opinion, why you have such an impact with your athletes when it comes to actual performance. So I kind of wanted you to talk about that, because I know that that's not always the most traditional, and I'm sure you, just like me, I'm sure have evolved so much as a coach over the years. And can you kind of take us through some of those stops and kind of some of the thought process behind that?
Yeah, no doubt. I think always just kind of had the intellectually curious mind about the body and training, going back to even like middle school, high school, when I was really getting into athletics and training a little bit. But obviously my first setting was kind of in football, and then a little bit of Olympic sports, and more classically trained in strength and conditioning. I think the thing I go back to that helps frame this is I don't know if you've ever read like Fergus Connolly's Game Changer, but the concept from there, like his four coactives are like the psychological, the physical, the technical, and the tactical. And there's kind of a different composition of these for each sport, right? But particularly when we're working with like these skill predominant sports, which baseball is, tennis, golf, particularly as you get to the higher levels, like the physical becomes a little less of the equation in
Mhm.
terms of, this is idiosyncratic too. Like, you know, um, Aaron Judge is 267, 280 pounds. That
Yeah, yeah,
his physicality plays a big part in what he does.
for sure.
So here's a great example, take from another sport, but he has it in his book. Like he compares Tom Brady and Cam Newton when they were both like MVP level players. Like the physical component for Tom was much less than it was for Cam Newton,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Both were awesome players, but it was different. So just understanding that and just understanding baseball as a whole, and then as I'm going through these different systems and models, FMS, DMS, PRI, SFMA, TPI, just still making too many mistakes, and they're kind of being, not to shit on these programs or whatever, FRC, all these, but I was still just not content with my interventions, results, those types of things. Is like, I wasn't connecting the dots well enough and working backwards from the field well enough, right?
Yeah.
So as I was kind of working through these different systems, I was starting to understand that and appreciating the skill element of baseball and understanding, you know, uh, there's an idiosyncratic nature of how each guy's doing that. Made me kind of understand I really got to start working backwards from the game. But then the light bulb really went off for me when I started using Bill Hartman's model. So he looks at the ISA rib cage,
Mhm.
wide, narrow kind of spectrum. And then one of my other mentors, Mike K, that the dots really started to connect here. And then I started to really refine my model in terms of working backwards from the field to now. And this becomes more important the higher level in sport you are too.
Yeah.
Right? If we're having a conversation about high school baseball players, like the physical becomes a greater percentage of those kind of four elements I talked about.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? We get to college, like we'll throw 50% in high school, give or take. Some players maybe 60, some 40, right? You get to college, it's a little less. You get to pro ball, it's a little less. You
Mhm.
get to, big leaguers and all that, uh,
Just
it
a just a
becomes
just
even less.
Yeah, question in here too, though. One of
Yeah.
the things that, like you said, it definitely the physicality becomes really important. But I think sometimes, and I know that we've discussed this as well, right? You're still laying foundational patterns when they start, exercising and all these other things. And so sometimes I think people can get in that spot and go, man, like they really need to get physical. They really need to do all these other
Yeah.
things. But then they can start building compensations, obviously, just like it doesn't matter if you're in the weight room or if you're out playing on the monkey bars or doing any activity, like the body is going to find a way to, do the task that you're asking it to do. And again, and obviously we have different, genetics, different upbringings. We do have foundational strengths where if we're playing sports and on the monkey bars and jumping and doing other things, like those are all exercises, right? Our body is adapting. And so I guess I just wanted to stop right there and also talk about that piece too, as well is, how do you view that? Even though, again, in high school, like, strength can become a big element. I still wouldn't say that you're saying that there's just this blanket of you can do whatever,
Yeah,
workouts
for
you want to
sure.
do, and that doesn't
Yeah.
really matter at this stage.
Yeah.
It's physicality, but you're also, again, still building foundational, principles
Mhm.
at the same time, right?
Yeah. So I think the thing they're saying, Kay, is developing force production and physicality is there's an adaptation to the skeleton as well,
Yeah.
right? So no, okay, here's the easiest way to understand a principle is to use the extreme,
Mhm.
right? So say I have a power lifter, right? They're trying to squat 700 pounds, lift whatever off the ground. Is the last thing they want happening is their spine turning in these exercises, right? And they got to create as much force as humanly possible. So they're going to squeeze every muscle and every bit of everything they can in their body to compress. So smush myself A to P, front to back, to get wider. My sockets, proximal femurs, humerus, everything start turning out here. Okay. So now I've limited these turns. I'm just really good at squeezing, compressing, and bending stuff. So
Yeah.
as I'm 13, 14, and I start to introduce myself into strength training, is certainly there's the neural elements and developing the coordination. But over time, as I get stronger, then I start to have these adaptations in shape as well too. Like
Yeah.
a femur can get more compressed and shorten and create more twists. The more and more you get into it, and part of this will depend on the structure that you're starting with each of these individuals.
Can you open, I don't want to run too far past that for, certain audience. Like, so when you're saying, obviously, as you're going through and you're like, hey, the body starts adapting and getting wider for, like, again, adapting for absolute, power, strength, stability, all these
Yeah.
different things.
Uh-huh.
Can you unpack that a little bit too, of like, from the basics, like why would the body want to get wider? Like, what does that do when it comes into, I know that, this is where I kind of want to start opening up, because I know it's going to go into a lot of our postural adaptations, is why would the body want to get wider? What does that do for the body for it to be able to create more force like that?
Yeah. So basically what I'm doing is so zoomed out. I need external rotation, or I need a space to be able to create an IR or downforce. So I think of, and I start to think of this more three-dimensionally, moving on helices, not, the three sagittal, frontal, transverse. Okay, but all our movements are helical in nature. So think of like ER as a turn out and up. I'm creating the space to then create the IR. Right now, the more relative motion I have, the more that's going to dampen force production. Right. Okay. So if I compress myself front to back, everything starts turning out here. I'm going way out there to create just a little bit of space to then lay a lot of IR down. Now it's largely going to be compensatory. I'm gonna squeeze stuff together and create a lot of anterior. So here's the best example of this. Okay. Think of like old West Side barbell box squats. Right? Where the feet are turned way out, where the knees are going way out, okay? Okay, because what you want is you want it to be really, if I'm trying to get strong as hell, you want it to be really difficult to deform connective tissue, right? Because so if I'm trying to squat 700 pounds, okay, and I'm going to be really good at that, you want to be the type of you've adapted the type of structure where it takes me 500 plus pounds on my back to get to a parallel squat, because then you're yielding from the skeleton.
Yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
that's the most massive type of skeletal and shape adaptation that you can think of, and it's sometimes that's the easiest to see and start to translate. So here's another example. It's like, think of guys who use like a bench press.
Yeah.
Okay. And think of how hard it is for them to get the bar to their chest because of all the compression in the system. Right. But we relate this, like the same things happen in training. Is like the connective tissue is becoming so overcoming that eventually it doesn't yield.
Yeah. I was gonna say, literally, they have, I'm sure you've seen it, when the bench press they'll have people, like, it's like a band that connects from like your arms and runs across your chest.
Yeah,
and I'm like, that's literally what your connective tissue, like, as you get stronger, again, that arm line and everything, where it's like, that tension and that stability you feel is like what you're building up, right? As you train those ways, right? Like you said, it's not yielding, right? Which is giving them stability to be able to, go back the opposite direction. But I think it's interesting in that way, like literally how you just explained that is like the how that you need that load even to get into those ranges. And also too, as you mentioned, you're hitting on all these things right off the jump of, I've told you that my own story, where I got, again, I went into college, I was 155 pounds. I'm this little skinny, mini thing playing second base and middle infield. And they're like, hey, you need to gain some weight. And so I started doing all these massive loads. I started building up heavy squats, and I started building up heavy deadlifts and heavy, everything really, really heavy. Right. But as I started doing that, my structure started to change. Right. And I started getting wider. I started becoming as I know we're gonna get into, I also became way less athletic when it comes into like
Yeah.
what athleticism looked like. I could push a lot of weight. I started being the strongest deadlifter and the strongest squatter on all the teams that I was on. But again, it robbed me of other things because the body was adapting to how I was training it. And that was a big thing for me is, and we've talked about this is what, me and you kind of pulled together in the very beginning is like, man, there's nothing worse than working really hard in the wrong direction.
No.
And so when we just say this blanket statement of just like get in the weight room, do all these other things, again, it can cause some, bigger things that I know when players get to you. And, we talk about this a lot and you post a lot on social media. And if you don't follow them on Twitter, definitely go there. You can see kind of the before and afters, and you do a good job of like pointing out the differences of what it looks like from an assessment and then how you guys program and exercise selection and all these other things. But as you're mentioning here, and I want to just really drive home, is how we train, like the body does adapt. And that's where a lot of the things we're going to be going into is like the training is really important and how we train really makes the body adapt in a bunch of different ways. And I think that that's, really important. Well,
No doubt. So, the thought that always comes to mind is, quote I've heard that's been, I learned it from Bill Hartman, is economist that came up with, I can't remember his name, but there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? So for me to drive the force production and drive some of these strength related adaptations, I'm going to have to give up something as well too. And to hit on one other thing too is, so as we're creating these shape changes and adaptations via training to where now we can no longer be dynamic in the shapes that we're creating. So we don't change our individual structure, which we haven't really gotten into that yet, but like by a more of like a narrow ISA versus a wide ISA, that won't change. But what can change is these shapes that I kind of get stuck in, and I no longer have the dynamic capability to change shapes, right? Which means at that point,
great point.
At that point, I just have to bend connective tissue in order to try and store and release energy or get into these positions. And again, and not saying this is good or bad, but we want to understand exactly, I have a clear lens to really understand what we're seeing, and then the understanding why and how they got there. And then that helps us develop the system to understand, is this a good adaptation, for the hitter or pitcher or whoever it is. And also where it is in terms of the efficacy of that adaptation at this moment is not necessarily the same 6, 12, 18 months down the road.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times there are shelf lives to these strategies that we adopt.
Yeah. What would you say let's go the opposite extreme of all that. Let's say I've grown up playing a ton of basketball, right? A lot of jumping, a lot of bounding, a lot of, over and over again. Like, again, when it comes into kind of that view, and just like you said, to give some of the extremes some different directions, when it comes to some of those things, what are some things that you see also as well when it comes, what would that extreme kind of look like?
Yeah, so I know I've seen this a good bit, particularly I've seen this on the pitching end. So oftentimes with the basketball players, okay, the adaptation to the jumping element of the sport and some of these quick change of directions is they want their center of gravity and center mass pushed as close to max propulsion as possible. So max P, like being when the heel comes off the ground, right? These tend to be like stiffer connective tissues, right? Like not as stiff as like a power lifter, but I'm playing basketball, I'm going up for rebound. I don't want my counter movement to be really deep, right? Okay, I want them to be stiff enough that it can be a quick descent and then I explode up with all this energy, right? So a lot of times it is stiffer connective tissue. It is center of gravities that are pushed forward, like where the basketball guys are known for kind of walking, weight towards the ball of the foot a lot, right?
Yeah.
So so then a lot of times with these guys also too, it's trying to gain back some of this rotation because their center of gravity has gone really far forward, right? So especially like I see this a lot with like the pitchers that can't get back into their heel at all, and also to a certain degree hitters. So that oftentimes there's a pretty good engine in there. They're pretty good at moving the guts up and down kind of throughout the thorax from all their jumping exposures and that degree, and pressurizing the outlet, but oftentimes struggle with the rotation. So there's, again, it's like there's a big connective tissue adaptation. It's gonna be a little different than the presentation we'd see with like somebody's got like a, more like a powerlifting type background.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to point that out because, again, as you also mentioned, your shortstops, your center fielders, a lot of them that are really, and again, obviously it's not every single one of them, but my point is a lot of them as well. A lot of them are stuck, more in that propulsion type. You set up there, they like to be on the balls of their feet. While this can be a great thing for them to play defense,
Yes.
we can see issues with it when it comes into the box because it's a different task. And a lot of people just assume that if I'm a good athlete, that means I'm going to be a great hitter in the box. And like those go hand in hand. And again, obviously, as I've seen you do with so many different athletes, is how, like you said, as you start to change by how you're programming and all those other things, they can have more success in the box because of some of the center mass adaptations and some of the things that I know that you do a really good job of. And I can see, me and you talked a lot about, I really love, I could always tell if we're, again, we might go about it in different ways, but when I see about it is when I see you show before and after, I'm like, oh my God, that's a way better position. Like the shapes that guy is creating compared to what he was creating before in the box, like I can see those big differences. And that's why I know that you're, the programming that you're also doing, and then also too, obviously you've had the opportunity to have, different coaching staffs within as well, and see, like, again, you've kind of been a constant while you've had some of that and still seeing, some of those results on the field. So it's not purely just from the skill side when it comes into, like batting practice and just a hitting coach or all these other things, right? But also things that you guys are primarily doing in the weight room. And so just to kind of circle back, as we kind of talk about that, right? Like, why don't you kind of open up just generally for the audience, like how our posture, right, is developed as like athletes. And I know we started to talk about some different like extremes, but I think like you said, I want to get into the place where you said like, how was this created in the first place? Because I think, like you said, you made a great point of like how that goes about how we're going to actually go about it. So why don't you kind of open that up so we can go that way?
Yeah, so really there's two elements that are gonna, there's the starting conditions and then two elements kind of the compensation of the body is going to be at the infrasternal angle or those lower ribs, kind of the floating ribs, right?
Rick, can you restart with that? You said the two elements and then it froze for a second. Can you restart
Oh,
with
geez. Internet. So starting conditions, then the two elements. So starting conditions being kind of looking at the ISA and the rib cage. So those lower ribs, kind of floating ribs, the more malleable piece. So if I have a narrow ISA, I have more of an inhaled axial skeleton, more ER axial skeleton. So then to finish respiration, I got to get air out. So that's why they kind of have this closing and IRing of these lower ribs, right? And then the opposite for these wides who have more of an IR axial skeleton. Now they've got to get air in somehow. So they have this ER out and up of the ISA. So these are kind of like, there's more layers, but the starting conditions. And then ultimately what we're trying to do, we got to manage gravity and we got to manage internal forces in our body. Okay. So I think gravity is pretty easy to understand for everybody, but also there's these internal forces. So for digestion to flow in one direction, for circulation, for arteries to pump away from the heart and get venous return, I need asymmetrical flow. So that's where these internal forces in the body. So kind of think of my organs kind of tumbling forward and falling to the left, kind of like a current taking me right to the left, right? Is my body's constantly battling this force and managing gravity. So then a narrow with a higher center of gravity, a wide with a lower center of gravity, fighting these internal forces. In both cases, they're going to kind of push the left sacrum ilium forward as kind of like a paddle if I'm going across the river and the current's pushing me right to the left. Makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I want to just, I know the audience, just because generally I know there's someone's like, what's an ISA? And I want,
Yeah.
I know for
Yeah, I think I covered that. So that, yeah, those are the lower ribs. Okay.
yeah. Yeah. So the lower rib cage, he's talking through the lower
Yep.
rib cage when we're identifying if that's somebody's a wide or a narrow when he's talking about that. And then the flow, he's talking about, again, internal pressures of this flow of fluids and guts and all of those things inside of our body, and how we also just genetically and also just because of how we're built, like, there's a current that is running in our body from how we're built from birth, anyways.
Yeah, but you got to understand these concepts if you're then gonna, and this is all based off Bill's model that I have a dogmatic subscription to because I've done all the models and this is the only one that makes damn sense. But so that's going to then dictate how your center of gravity moves forward into these compensations based off these two things, managing gravity and the internal forces. So these different starting conditions, and then these two elements will drive kind of where I end up. So like when I'm looking at a hitter, the first thing I'm trying to understand is like, where is their center of gravity, right? Because it's most everybody will get lateralized to the right. When we drive more and more end game compressions and orientations, but they're going to get there differently, and then the presentation there is going to look differently as well. Okay, but then what I'm doing is I'm looking at this center of gravity. So that's kind of the starting point. Where's the center of gravity? And then from there through the axial skeleton and also the extremities is how are they creating the space for the ER, and then how are they creating the actual force in the ground, the internal rotation. So I have to like, here's the center of gravity, here's the shape of if I look from the ground up, the foot, the tibia, the femur, the hip, and now and I can look, I go, okay, center of gravity's here, this is the shape. I'm looking at the same thing, a right-handed hitter. I'm going to know how energy is going to be transferred up that chain into the pelvis from the ground.
Yeah.
Right.
I think you make a great, and one of the things I wanted to point there that you just broke into is that a lot of people assume that everybody's center of gravity is the same, which obviously it's not, right? But just, from a general person that doesn't know anything from the strength side and all the things, right? Everybody's like, oh yeah, between my feet, directly through the middle part of my body, that's going to be my center of gravity. And it's like, as our, again, like as he mentioned, through each joint, they all have different ranges of motion. They're all tilted in different ways. And again, along with that, based on like how we move, all these things that happen throughout our life, those things changes. And so, Rick's center of gravity, again, even if we put on a little bit of weight, right, that's going to change where our center of gravity is and things as well. So I think one of the things, again, before we move forward, is just to point that out, is that he's saying is like, we have to assess center of gravity for every single player because that gives us also a lens to start viewing the body from, again, where they find not only stability or where they're currently the positions that they like to sit in. And that's going to give you a lot of indication of how they're going to create force, transfer force, how, recruit, yada, yada, yada. I just wanted to point that out that, again, obviously, I didn't want to run past that, is like center of gravity is a massive thing, and not everybody's is the same. Like everybody's is different based on all these different movements in the body and different joints.
Yeah. So here's a good example to explain that better is, okay, so your actual center of gravity sits right in front of S2. So think of my sacrum, okay, just below my lower back, right? So if I have more of a nutated sacrum, or the bottom of the sacrum is tipped up like this, so I have all the space on the backside, that's going to bring my center of gravity more down and back. Where if it's tucked, the sacrum's tucked under more on a narrow, this kind of counter nutated, is this center of gravity is going to be forward and higher. So then, okay, here's a great example. Okay, you're going to run sprints with your accelerations with your position players. Okay, this wide is the one who's going to accelerate really well because the center of gravity is down and back, and they have a longer IR window to push down. And so you think of your guys that come out these really nice, cool acceleration angles, those are going to be your wider guys. Okay. So I have a cool little slide I show in a presentation. It's like Ricky Henderson versus I think like Billy Hamilton. All right. So two speedsters, stole a lot of bases. Okay. but you look at the angle that they drive out at, it's much different because the center of gravity is in a different starting condition, right?
Yeah.
And then that affects everything. That, you know, what position we get in the weight room, obviously
Yeah.
hitting, all those types of things. But it starts with there, and understanding the center of gravity, some of the shapes of the foot, the tibia, the femur going up in the thorax, and you'll know how. Because what's the purpose of a gather for a hitter? It's usually there's a momentum aspect, right? A gaining energy from the ground, and then there's the timing aspect,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's like what I'm trying to kind of ascertain is like, how are they going to collect this energy up from the ground? And then from there, based off their shapes, what are their options to then start to push this energy back down in the ground?
Yeah. Yeah. No, love that. And then, again, as you're mentioning there, right, you brought up Billy and Ricky Henderson, right? As you mentioned, like obviously guys that are both guys that are known for stealing bases. Again, they both get these really high accelerations and speeds. They do it in different ways of how they go about recruiting that same way. But again, obviously everybody would agree with the results of them. But
Yeah.
this also comes back to, I know that you've mentioned this before, right? Where it's like we start forcing everybody. Oh well, you gotta have the same angle as Ricky Henderson, or you start setting up all these drills and all these things to try to force people to create force this way. And obviously there's a lot more going on underneath the hood that has to be considered to do that, right? And then also, as you mentioned, as you get higher and athletes become more athletic, one thing I'll add on to this, right? And I've heard you say this as well, is like you got to be aware that this could cause, they're so powerful, right? As they create more and more power, you got to be careful of not forcing people into positions or with high forces that like their body hasn't aligned that way for a reason. And it doesn't necessarily mean for pitching, maybe a little bit different, right? They could get, maybe it's a couple, there's so much forces like on particular joints that you got to be a little bit more careful than maybe, running or something like that. But at the same time, when you start obviously doing like change of direction and all these other things, I just wanted to make the point that it is important where these underlying things are big, because it could lead to injuries, overuse, yada yada yada. That all plays into it too.
Yeah, and then I know we've talked about this a little bit before. Is like you're talking about some of these really good runners and the adaptation to have a lot of speed and be explosive. The orientation of the pelvis, where the center of gravity goes. Oftentimes, this can make it really, really hard to delay a backside as a hitter.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, oftentimes our 70 plus grade runners, guess what?
Yeah.
It's usually not a great hit tool, right? And
Yeah.
because it goes back to this though,
Yeah.
okay? There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Like I
Yeah.
had to give something up. So then like
Yeah.
that's where we've talked about a little bit. Like these guys may be more like bigger kickback guys, right? Because
Yeah.
like they can't hold the backside as long, so they kind of it's more front leg impulse, right?
Yeah.
It's like they find these other strategies, but again, it's like that's what makes us a better practitioner and better in player development. It's like
Yeah.
when you understand these starting conditions and where these things lie, then you know what the possible movement affordances are. And I think that's the biggest issue in player development right now is we're not looking at the body correctly, like
Yeah.
the actual lens and understanding like how idiosyncratic this is in terms of like we talked about the ISA, but also there's a relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis in terms of the diameter that affects pressurization. Like there's all these elements, and the better we understand that, the better we understand why they're doing what they're doing, and if that's going to be successful for them, and if so or if not, for how long.
Yeah, no, and I really wanted to make that literally like you mentioned as well, right? Like you also don't want to take away what makes them elite, right? So like, we train Paige Sinicki over at Oregon, right? She's their shortstop. She's one of the fastest girls in all of college softball. She's, again, like same thing, stuck in propulsion, right? Like always on the balls of her feet, always big extensions, like, pelvis is anterior tip, dramatically, right? All these things. And again, like loves giving up her backside, like has such a hard time, staying in it, and also has a really hard time creating powerful torques because again, she's so quickly out of the ground, stuck in extension, some of these other things where she can't get into some of these late torques that you need, as well when it comes into hitting. And like you mentioned, so it's like, okay, now you got to develop strategies based around, like when she first came to us, the coaching staff, rightfully so, as you mentioned, they don't, she's on the extreme of a spectrum, right? So a lot of hitting coaches don't know what to do with this extreme body type, and they can't get them to produce. And that's why, like, even too, like her team and all those things reaching out. And then as she trained more and more, she became even more down that extreme route. And then, so again, along with that, even how she's getting programmed in the gym is extreme for the strength coach to figure out, her body's adapting in different ways than other athletes to those same exact exercises. And that becomes where it becomes more difficult, and you need more of a skilled practitioner, like a higher level of care for these really far down certain spectrums to view the body, as you're mentioning, from a much higher level. And again, just to point this out as well, if you haven't figured out already, is again, Rick challenges me. I love having Rick with that, because again, like how you view the body and how, again, just how you view Hartman's model when you first founded day one compared to now. I know that you've also developed your other side. So he's opened up my brain to a lot of these intricacies that come into these different body types, postural limitations, and adaptations that have really changed how I've viewed how these hitters are creating these forces and making these adaptations. But I just really wanted to point that out, because again, it happens a lot for some of these positions, or some of the extremes of the positions, like a catcher. Catchers also have a really hard time. But I looked one day and I said, man, majority of our clients are catchers, shortstops, center fielders. Wonder why that is. And they all struggle with hitting. What is going on, right? And it's like, and then I came out with a post the other day talking about how catchers, because of their position, a lot of people try to go to catching because they feel like, oh, catchers can't hit and I can hit. So let me go catch, and all of a sudden I'll go get picked up. And it's like, well, hey, like, if you're squatting every day and doing all these things and working all these receiving, catching all these bullpens and doing this every day, why don't we kind of touch on that for a second? Because I feel like that's might be the opposite extreme of someone that's stuck in propulsion. So yeah, why don't you kind of open that up?
Yeah, so generally with your catchers, you're going to see these wider structures, wider ISAs, generally because the bigger target, better for receiving, right?
Yeah.
And framing and those types of things. But what I see an awful lot is the adaptation at the foot. Okay, because first of all, they're not structures that are designed. A structure that's designed really well for a deep squat is actually a really narrow person. So generally, like for a catcher to get out in there, they gotta splay the knees out pretty far to be able to, like that. So what is that? Again, that's just, I'm trying to create the space. I got to create it somehow. So what you see like proximal top of the femurs turn out a lot, hip socket orientations. So you live in hip labrum land a lot sometimes with these guys. And then, to be able to drop down and put pressure through the foot, oftentimes, like I see like a bend through the foot as well. So they may have, like, people would call it like potentially like a flat foot, but it may be like a heel that's turned out and up in the ER, but then it's like right in front of that in the midfoot is where they're bent into the ground. So sometimes, like, I've seen with catchers a decent bit is like kind of like foot spin, stuff like that, because of some of the adaptations to the foot based off catching. But yeah, these guys, and that's so many catchers, okay, think like wide catchers, wide stance, maybe like no stride guys, things like that. Like there's the adaptation at the femur, the pelvis, that are kind of shaping their strategies and their movement options as a hitter now. And again, like, not saying right, wrong, but it's just like, let's get a better lens to start to understand why, and then like what is reasonable in terms of changing something or not. And like, this is the thing I challenge people all the time, and I challenge myself because I'm trying to get better with it myself too. But developing a system or framework for making these decisions. So like, again, I'm saying, well, I'm not saying good or bad. So my lens is output, productivity, and health. So like a hitter, okay, output there. So we're looking at bat speed, we're looking at exit velocity, stuff like that. Do we check those boxes? Okay, we do. And we're good right there. Okay, productivity. So all of our offensive KPIs. So launch angle, average launch angle at balls hit over 95, like heart zone contact, like all these different KPIs we could use. So
Yeah.
Now we start to understand productivity. Is it there or is it not?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we need to make changes? And the last bit is like health. So have they had stuff, or based off our own experiences, have we seen this enough till we know we're awful close to that line between performance or health that maybe we need to give this guy just a little bit of relative motion kind of safety buffer because he's getting close to pushing this strategy too far.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
and that's and so the point that you're going into, right, is like not every adaptation or asymmetry obviously is bad, right?
Yeah.
And also too, again, the body has created that to complete the task that it's being asked to do, right? It's
Yeah.
doing this work all the time over and over again, right? If I'm playing shortstop, like there's a need to be, up to speed really quick, change your directions, all those other things, that's really important for that position. And then also too, I was going to bring up with this is, do you think this is also why with certain catchers, they've been starting to do a lot more like the knee down, extended leg, these are
Yeah.
like as you mentioned, right? A narrow wants to be like more in a deep squat, and so for them to be able to get low enough to get underneath some of these pitches and get some of these calls, and also be able to move. I as you were talking, I was just thinking about like them having their knees out and doing some of that stuff too.
No, you're 100% spot on, and I love it when they can do it. It's like they get in the kickstand, whatever it may be. It's like this is a body that's not shaped right for deep squatting, so something's going to have to bend to get them there. So usually the hip, lumbar, spine, and what do guys tell you all the time when they get into these positions is like it kind of saves their legs and saves their back, right? So it's like, just again, understand. So I guess another latent benefit of that be potentially you're helping them on the hitting end a little bit too, is that you're giving them preserving a little more of their movement freedom. By using some of these strategies catching wise as well too.
Yeah. And I wanted to kind of touch on this as well, is that like you've hit on this a couple times already, but as well, okay, so let's say someone's not meeting the KPI. So let's say somebody is not meeting, these things, right, where they've gone too far down the super compensation, or maybe they just gone to a place where again it's become unproductive for the skill work or the skill set that we need them to have, right? This person's about to be released. This person's, again, their numbers have gone backwards. They've regressed. They've done some other things based on some of these things as well. And why don't we kind of start touching on how you program specifically for those types of situations when you're, and again, obviously high level, I know there's details for every single, different factor, but high level, what are some things and philosophy that you're kind of looking at of how to unpack them or rewind them as you kind of touch on?
Yeah. Okay. So, I think maybe an easier one to look at was like maybe the productivity bucket is what we're missing, right? Like, output is there, but not making enough contact or contact's not in the air enough to fulfill what their needs are for the team and their lineup, position and lineup, the role, whatever it may be. So let's use an example. Let's say, okay, so say we're going back to some of these good runners. Maybe I got like a shortstop. We'll say right-handed hitter. So we'll say narrow ISA. Most of your shortstops are going to be narrower structures, right? So say they've gotten their center of gravity's gone all the way over to that right side. And like the taller they are, so you'll see this in more magnified in pitchers, but you'll certainly see it in the position players. So they go like the 6'6", skinny, real skinny, narrow pitcher. Oftentimes you'll see like that super droopy right shoulder, right? So that's like that's the pull down. So they're getting so far lateralized onto that right side that the only way they're going to prevent their center of gravity from literally like falling over their right foot, they start bend and squeezing down that right side, like literally pushing air out of the thorax to try and find a way to push down on the ground and stay within their base of support. Make sense?
Yep.
So if I do that with a right-handed hitter, say it's I know this because I've seen this a lot. Center fielder, shortstop, good runner, good athlete, whatever. Okay. This pull down right here, that's the way that they push down into the ground. right? So they're creating whatever I'm doing in the thorax, or whatever I'm doing in the thorax, I'm doing in the pelvis as well.
Yeah.
That's kind of part of Bill's model, these analogous structures, right? So when I think of this guy, is he's so pulled down, squeezed down. So a good way to think of this is like a towel. Okay. If we
Yeah.
think just like the femur, is I'm going to keep twisting that towel kind of on the top and the bottom till eventually, I run out of twists. And then to keep pushing down this towel, now it can't twist. It bends like a bamboo pole. Okay. So this
Love
would
that.
be like,
Yeah.
yeah. So somebody right leg, see this on narrows that are really compressed. The right leg will be kind of bow shaped right there. Okay. And even if they don't get quite to that point, what we'll see with these guys, there's a lot of push down, and then they had to create kind of an ER orientation. So think like the femur, top of the femur, the top of the shin, really ER to create a space to push down the ground. Okay. Is they no longer have access to a good turn into the backside. So what I see with these guys a lot of times is they're going to climb out and up with the hands and the barrel to try and create the space. Okay. And then now that I have this space, I have to own it and think of how these guys push into the ground. There's a ton of orientation, pelvis and thorax. This is going to be like the really steep attack angle.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the super narrow, pull down the right side, steep into the zone, steep out of the zone. You throw four seam heaters with good care in the top of the zone, they're screwed all day. Right. So, this becomes a big issue in terms of their ability to get the ball in the air. They were popping up or hitting balls into the ground. It's like, so now what I'm addressing, without going into crazy details of model of this, is I got to get vertical dimension back. I got to pop them back up on this right side, because every time they're going to go to push into the ground, it's going to be this hard yank.
Yeah, I wanted to point out this point that you just made, is this is what happens when, yes, they've had these adaptations. Yes, this is how their body likes to or prefers to create force. It's fast this way.
Yeah.
It creates a lot of force in this. This is what it's learned to do and adapt, right? But the problem with it is, like you talked about, production wise, is when I get to higher levels, sometimes, right, what becomes a problem is, well, now I can expose that, because it's not, we're not just hitting the same ball off a tee every single time, right? We're having to hit balls in different parts of the zone that are breaking, that are doing all these different things. And so when you take it in for somebody else, again, they might still be able to be productive with this, but if they go too far down a spectrum at times, right, that again, it can start to cause some of these issues where it's like, yeah, I can hammer balls at the bottom of the zone, or I can hammer balls in these specific locations, but I have these bigger holes in my swing where I, again, lack exit velocity or the ability to get on plane with these pitches or be able to hit any ball hard. And these, sometimes it's the opposite, sometimes it's balls in the top of the zone, right? I hammer all these, but anything down and away from me or low in the zone, I really have a problem hitting it in the air and hitting it with power. And, obviously that can be that I get exposed as a hitter and at the higher levels. And we've been doing this for scouting for years. We've seen the results of this, but not necessarily, like you mentioned, understand the why of what's going on. And then you got a hitting coach in the cage just trying to cue the hell out of them, when in reality, like, there's these bigger adaptations that you're fighting that also have to be addressed from over in the weight room, their exercise selection, or their lack of being in the weight room. As you know, and I know, there's a lot of guys that are literally would just abandon the weight room for 9 months when they're playing throughout the year. And that's obviously another problem as well, right? So, so I just wanted to make that point, is that, yeah, man, they are fast. Like, they do create a lot of power maybe through this. They've learned a strategy to do that, but it might leave holes in their game, which is why, again, that's where, having a good relationship and I've done the opposite of what other people have said, is like, hey, no, strength is far more important than you realize. Like, the body and like what they're doing in the weight room is far more important. So you just not spending money on your strength coaches or having your strength coach do 10 different sports and trying, and having them manage that many athletes and all, like, how important it is. If anything, I'm trying to get you a raise here, Rick. This is what I'm saying here. is that again, that, man, having somebody like, Rick, or someone that can really view the body from, these lenses is, major impactful on
Yeah.
the performance of what happens with your athletes on the field. And again, as a coach that gets paid on his wins and losses, it's nice to have somebody like Rick on your team is basically my point.
Well, so I think the part you kind of allude to is there has to be kind of a paradigm shift in terms of the mental model of the impact from some of the performance training, right? So the current mental model of this is where I work with a lot of like MLB teams, is the weight room is seen as this player development tool to increase output without the understanding of how we're affecting these other elements too. So like when we look at productivity, like bat path, kinetics, so forces into the ground, front leg, back leg, all these types of things are going to be more so impacted probably from performance training than anything else. So we have to understand like this is also a vehicle to improve these other elements. If we really start to understand the shapes that they're creating, and I think the most important thing to understand is the bat path and the shape, and the bat that is ultimately determined by the movement of the guts, the internal organs in the body. I cannot swing the bat faster than I can move my guts. Okay, and so here's a good example. Think of somebody who gets like we've been using right-handed hitters, right-handed hitter with a really hard like arm bar. Okay, left arm straight strategy. Okay, that's somebody who can't create this turn and can't get the guts to move up towards the kind of right anterior thorax, okay, kind of up into their right thorax. So they can only hold them back by shoving them kind of way to the outside, kind of the thorax, pelvis, and that's how they're going to hold them back to store energy. Can absolutely be successful, but again, this just kind of helps us understand the why of it a lot better, if that makes. So here's a great, okay, so simple pelvic mechanics and all that. I'm a right-handed hitter. I'm going into my gather. I'm creating a turn on the right side. That is my kind of sacrum moving back on the ilium. So it's the same as propulsion or gait. That's early propulsion. That's a heel strike. Okay. So right foot stepping forward, heels hitting the ground. Okay. If I'm compressed and squeezed like that, okay, I can't create this relative motion in that turn right there. I got to turn everything as a unit. Okay. And that's kind of what you see is like, the guts are going to go along with it, kind of be held back here, which may be an arm bar, guys who have really good connect tissue and can bend through the thorax more, that may not be as much of an issue. But again, it's like the bat pass. So pitching, we're talking about shapes we create in the ball and ball flight. Here, we're talking about bat path. It goes back to where can you actually move your guts, right? That's where your potential energy is going to come from, because you're just this big bag of water that's going to create this potential energy.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of times when we'll say, and where I've always seen it as the middle, right? Which, it is the middle, but at the same time, there's layers, right? There's layers of depth, of complexity of what's actually happening in the middle. And like, if the middle doesn't move this way, like, proximal to distal, yes, but there's layers, like there's layers of what's actually causing all of that to happen. And so, again, how we had done it in the past is like, well, we saw, like, as you mentioned, right? They have no ability, as you would explain it, from like, the guts going that way. I was like, I was just trying to create the shapes, and again, it's not necessarily a bad strategy, but also too, if you understand more and more layers of the complexity, there's different ways of, programming and exercise selection and other things that you would view, especially from like twisting elements and other things, as you mentioned, of like, if someone's really pulled down or there's some, major compensations that they've done, to do that, again, it's not going to be fixed with, 2 exercises or, just a little bit of prep work before they get in the cage. Like, there is, the strength room and what they're doing in there is going to be a big deal.
So here's, sorry to jump in, but here's one that I think is important that can help convey it too is, so I took this analogy from Mike K, one of my mentors, and we've talked about this a little bit, but kind of viewing this 2-dimensional representation, but still works well for like a narrow versus wide hitter. The narrow is kind of like this more narrow type half pipe that kind of has this kind of smaller middle space. The wider is kind of this wider half pipe. I think of like skateboarding or whatever. So, but think of this, if I have a narrow who's got a ton of like sternal compression, so think of like their chest kind of pulled down with this anterior thorax orientation,
Mhm.
the guts can't get up there, right? I got this
Yeah,
pull, I got this
that's a
block
great
there.
analogy.
So I have this narrow hitter with a lot of like sternal compression, this pump handle's pulled down. Yeah, we kind of want them to be able to get their guts up there. But the first thing they're going to do, they're going to kind of splat into the ground and get wide,
Yeah.
right? Because they don't have the room. I know because I can think of one of our players right there. I'm just thinking about this, but seeing this a bunch of times. So it's like, okay, yes, I have the structure that should be able to do this theoretically, but I have to understand the shapes that have changed over the course of time that now have provided me a different affordances of possible movement there.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I really like the half pipe analogy. It gave a visual in my head. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm just viewing, I'm like thinking about that too. It's like, man, you really want this, back and up,
Mhm.
stretch of, and then you talk about this. The reason that also this is important, I remember when you made this point to me, is how important these structurals and these postures are to, again, effectively being able to get that connective tissue stretches that a lot of people would say that they want. They say they
Mhm.
want, again, there's stretches across the middle. I talk about this a lot within connective tissue. And then you're like telling me, like, Joette, I agree with you. Like, okay, we want to get these stretches, but that player can't get there, right? And can't effectively get into some of those stretches and those uses to be able to create a lot of that torque or that reflexive type responses because of how their body is literally like put together, right? Like, and how it's currently what it's adapted to, right? And so, yeah, can you kind of open that up a little bit too about how these have an impact, layers out to as well, and like how well I can use my connective tissue and crossbody strength and yada yada yada, all that, some of that stuff.
Yeah, certainly. So, generally speaking, like your narrows, with more ER axial skeleton, they're going to be biased a little more towards expansive type connective tissues. So they're going to rely more on that. So they have to create a momentum, and this is kind of like the half pipe, like an on ramp to then create their force into the ground. Makes sense. Versus think of like a big wide like no strider.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of on ramp. It's a system that pressurizes a lot easier. So here we go.
Yeah.
Hopefully everybody can envision this. So think of like a fixed volume cylinder so think like a hockey puck. Okay. So that would be like real wide, okay, versus say I got like a tall, skinny syringe. Let's say, you know, the lengths of them, everything, it's the same volume with inside of them. Okay, think of how hard it is to kind of deform the shape of that hockey puck and kind of that short, wider type cylinder versus this long one. Okay, so this is a system that's going to pressurize much easier. So that's like, okay, I'm out wide. This is the helical angle I turn on. These are no striders, maybe like shallow toe tappers,
I was thinking like Paul Goldsmith, like a very, tighter, and then compared to somebody like Mookie Betts. Mookie
Yeah.
Betts has more of a down move, right? Where he's
Yeah.
like, he's creating a down to get a response like out of the ground comparatively to, Paul, who's like really wide, kind of more of a toe tap and then firing like two different hitters that
Yeah,
pressurize in
one.
different
So
ways.
that'll be a good example. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
now here's the other thing you gotta be careful a little bit is sometimes you may have like a narrow who gets really smushed and their spaces have moved out here. So they're kind of wider. Because so basically they have a heel angle, but now it's gotten bent. Right? It's like I can put my hands on somebody's lower ribs in ISA, and I may have one side that's turned like a right side that's turned out, and they have bent their helical angle. So say it's like a right-handed hitter, they bent that to try and create space to be able to move the guts and turn into that right side. So it's like this is where I work with a lot of people is don't get caught up into these dogmatic practices of aligning something exactly based off ISA. You have to understand kind of these other elements that are part of it too. It's not like all of our wides are going to do this, all of our narrows are going to do this. Like,
Yeah.
Oh, there's these strategies that they've developed over time. It's just,
Yep.
it gives you the lens to be able to understand the why better and then try and reverse engineer the intervention.
Yeah, and then as you mentioned too, on the other side of that, right? Like sometimes it's really good for and you probably do a better job of explaining this, but it's very good for what you would say, like just because a narrow would be better at this activity doesn't mean that I shouldn't have my wide doing this activity. Or just because my wide might be better and at this activity doesn't mean that it's like necessarily that the narrow, he couldn't do some things that the narrow will be, more benefited from, or not benefited from, but like being able to it's literally sometimes within programming, I'm doing things that I know they're not good at. Like that's the point of within the programming. Now, you got to add some context to that because you can't just have them, just asking to do all these things they can't do, and physical limitations and all these things and progressions or regressions and like all of this other stuff when it comes into the weight room stuff. But like, again, I think when we talk about training specifically is based around the idea that I'm trying to get you better at something that you're not, that you're not doing well and that you could be better at. So I think sometimes we get into this idea down the TPI route, down, different other routes where it's just like, oh, well, this is how he tests. So like, we're not going to ask them to do these activities. And
Yeah.
I get what they're meaning from like certain lenses, but at the same time, within training, again, I know that we can change these things. I mean, if movement and time and all these things have made them this way in the first place, there's definitely ways to rewind the clock, as you mentioned too, to get back some of these things as well. And I know that's a big piece. I don't know if you have a better way of explaining, what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, certainly to a degree without, I'm not going to take your most narrow presentation possible, like throwing him into like a straight bar deadlift setting or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
You're kind of throwing caution to the wind there.
Mm.
But a good example would be like a wide, high pressure system, generally more overcoming connective tissue, is then they love training and training makes them better until it doesn't. And then the connective tissue is too overcoming. That's a case, because I've done this a lot, is now we're really working on the ability to yield through connective tissue, which is not kind of, their realm, but they've driven themselves so far into that. We need to move that back a little bit. Or
Yeah.
like the narrows, yeah, they're not as good at force producers, but we need force production. So let's just find the positions, the length of impulses that best suit kind of their structures and positions, and then kind of drive those strategies. So we may be doing like more of like a vertical box squat with a little bit higher velocities. If they need to gain muscle mass, maybe we're doing it in the form of clusters versus longer sets where they drive more orientation. So it's like these little adaptations there can go a long way in terms of not driving them too far into some shapes that'll either put them in harm's way or maladaptation to what we're trying to accomplish on the field as well.
Yeah.
But
And
it's like some people like they'll say, oh, because I've heard this, like wide, you know, they're good at hinging, so they need to work squatting a ton. It's like, okay, see, that's forcing a round peg into a square hole,
for sure.
And the other thing that's important to know, because I've made this mistake, and like this is a spectrum too,
I was about to
right?
say that. Yeah.
I have individuals that are just kind of a little bit wide or just a little bit narrow, where they work well floating between these different strategies and stuff. And then oftentimes with groups I work with, it's like one of the first things we try and do is just set up some bumper rails for some of the most extreme ends of the spectrum. It
Yeah.
makes sense in terms of like things that aren't going to work well with them, things that are, and then like your more middle-y that aren't too far on the other end of the spectrum, or like those are the ones where you really got to reverse engineer from the game, because
Yeah.
they might do some things, kind of on either end of the spectrum a little bit.
Yeah, no, and that was the point I was going to make, is that again, we love to talk about the extremes because it's easier to identify, someone that's really wide, someone that's, very narrow, and then like talk about the extremes. And then, but again, while that is, we break it into those pieces so that we can better understand, we got to know that nature is everything in between, and then also as you mentioned there as well, it's like, making sure as well, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, okay, great. But we also, if this person is having on the far end of one side of the spectrum is, again, we might need to back them towards away from that end of the spectrum to get higher performance out of them. And yeah, you know what?
Yeah.
They might be a little bit slower. They might create a little bit less force when it comes to the field, but their production on the field could go much higher. Even though that they're not creating maximum speed or maximum force at the system that could create, but because you have a task element, you have a skill element, you have something that you have to go and actually be able to do, and it's not about just being the fastest and the strong. Like we talked about this with one of our coaches. We are like, hey, would you just go and you go to recruit and you're like, I just want the strongest guy, I just want the fastest guy, and it's like, no, like in baseball, you're gonna go and you're gonna, like, I'm okay if my guy typically, and I'm gonna point this out, typically your strongest guy in the weight room almost never is your best player. Right. And then like same thing with your fastest guy. Usually your fastest guy ultimately necessarily well-rounded isn't your best player. He might be your fastest guy. Like, yeah, he hits that one mark. It doesn't mean that he's also your best hitter, your best defender, your best all those other things as well. Right. Because again, like as you mentioned from that quote that you put in the beginning, like I'm giving something up, right? If I want to be super elite at something, I'm giving other things up to be elite at that, right? If I want to be one of the best in the world at baseball, I might be really bad at, yoga or something, whatever, right? Like really far towards one direction. So it's like you're giving up, certain things to be able to do it. And the body is adapting. And that's why the asymmetries and adaptations to specific sports are important. And that's why I even think on the same side of that, right? Like you talk about like football players, right? You've gotten to work with both sports. Football, they're giving things up, right? Like so that they can create force and do the things that they need to be able to do for their sport. And then you grab a football player and you bring them over to baseball and you tell them to swing, and they're like, yo, this is the most athletic guy we got on the football team. What's going on? Why does he look so when he's trying to hit a ball? And it's like, again, they don't just cross over all the time, because, and there's other factors, of course, but do you want to touch on that because I know that you work multiple sports and like why and kind of like, what that degree is. Because I know the reason I brought that up is there's a lot of strength coaches that are trying to train guys like football players. And that is an extreme, while they are very physical, they look good, some of the aesthetic. You want to kind of touch on the differences that you've seen between the two sports there?
Yeah, I think you hit on it well in terms of like understanding the trade-off there. Is so I kind of consult and work with quarterbacks as well too. So oftentimes, okay, so here's kind of the conundrum there is you need force production, right? So generally the sprinting element, but also like body armor too. Like you're gonna get hit by 250-pound linebackers that could kill you if you're 170 pounds. So but also you're having to create the shapes through the exoskeleton to be able to get the ball in the right position to deliver it accurately. And again, it kind of comes back to gut position. So here's a great example. Tim Tebow. Watch his arm action as it changed kind of throughout his career. Okay. And actually why he probably got worse at throwing the football. Right. Is now he had limited movement potential. He had limited capability to move the guts and the thorax. So like, I'm thinking like a right-handed quarterback pulled down on the right, just like the right-handed hitter. So their sacrum is now facing right field. Imagine if I got to throw deep out to the left side of the field. What I got to try and do to turn my body in that direction. Okay. Side bend like crazy, through the left spine, left cervical spine, those types of things. So quarterbacks are kind of a cool example because you need some of these things, but you just have to constantly monitor back and forth how far are you pushing these, for each guy. So especially think like I think I have like a real narrow, skinny quarterback. So like Trevor Lawrence would be a guy, tall, skinny. I don't know if you remember, there's a guy named Glennon who was like 6'8" in the NFL. He used to play at NC State, but So they kind of have like these longer arm paths too.
Yeah.
You strength train the hell out of them, compress them, and that sternum gets pulled down. Well, guess what? We talked about before, the hitter, guts can't get up. Okay. They're going to get kind of stabby back there with the arm action. Right. And now this is a release that takes too much time. So I think like everybody loved Dan Marino and like his quick release.
Yeah.
Maybe dating myself here with some of your
No,
some
it was good.
but he was a little bit of a wider presentation, and kind of before he tore his Achilles, he could step and just pressurize so well, and that ball was out so fast.
Yeah.
You know? It's
Yeah.
like, again, it's all coming. So football too, it's like, you know, defensive back, like generally a defensive back, you're not going to be able to compress as much A to P, and why they tend to be a little smaller than like some of the wide receivers, because think of how they're having to turn through the thorax and the hips, because they're reacting to the wide receiver.
Yeah.
Vice versa, you can see some 6'2", 230-pound receivers
Yeah.
that don't have as much turn and movement capabilities, because, you know, they're making cuts and running in straight lines more so.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So now let's kind of just, I think just wrapping up here too is, why don't you kind of touch on, like, again, along with that, right? So as you go into, okay, you do your assessment, you understand kind of, you know, some of these adaptations of where their body sits posturally, some of those things. When you go into programming, high level 40,000 foot view, right? When you go into programming, what does that kind of look like? And also too, obviously I've seen you when you do, I love how you take the before and after pictures, and you can show some of these differences and, like, you know, where they're posturally sitting and some of those things as well. And but yeah, why don't you kind of talk about, like, programming, some of the things you're considering, and then what your, you know, methodology is, 40,000 foot view, you know, from above, from all these different, you know, structures.
Yep. So, like I said, like, real thorough assessment early on. So posture picks, we'll have our series of different movements that we'll do, and we usually I like to videotape them too, because I can go back and look at it, see if I missed anything, and also from a comparison perspective. So there's that intake. Then obviously, so we just developed our lab, so we'll get our hitters in the mocap. We're actually doing that this week, mocap and the force plate platform as well. Then we have our batted ball data. If it's a guy I've had previously, we have our offensive KPIs. So like that's like the whole picture right there, that then helps me understand, okay, here's their body structure, here's the shapes they can create, these are the strategies they use as a hitter. Again, like those three buckets: output, productivity, health. So then so say it's an output issue, is okay, is this really just a force production issue? And then we also have like our counter movement plates, so we jump on there as well too, which gives us some indication into that. So okay, maybe we can just drive the force and strength element for longer. First, I'll think, is there a shape issue? Because the adaptation of that is going to be less than the strength training, right? If I can get 5 more miles an hour on exit velocity via shape change, I'm going to take that over strength training 100 times out of 100, because of the adaptation cost for that, right? It's just like working through and understanding that guy and understanding each piece of that. So, you know, does their strategy work? Those 3 buckets, and then each guy will kind of come up with some of their pre-training, pre-hitting type stuff to kind of work in some of those shapes. And then when we actually get into the strength training, is because if every single program is not like specifically individualized to that degree, but we'll kind of bucket the guys based off, okay, you know, I got these wide guys that create some good shapes. We're going to drive force production, or maybe it's rate of force. Could be an issue there, or discrepancy there. I got narrows that are just focusing more on shape changes. Then, you know, maybe we're lifting at different velocities with different exercises, different shapes. So it's just kind of like the spectrum that sets up for like our main exercises, and then some of the ancillary stuff will we'll kind of go across archetype, but I think we do our best, especially in the pre stuff, is getting them and trying to get their center of gravity where we need to then put them in those positions, these kind of main lifts that best drive the strategy for kind of each of those guys, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's like,
go ahead.
I can give you one more example. Say it's like a wide guy who just so stiff, connective tissue won't yield at all. He's just kind of living on the outside edges of these feet. So like here's a guy that should have this nice long delay of the backside to help his forward movement timing, but he doesn't anymore because he's just a caveman living on the outside edges of his feet. Is we may be box squatting, but we're doing it through like a 6-inch foam pad that's working on some of the yield through the pelvis and stuff like that. So just kind of some of these little strategies that'll help. But I guess like every time I'm watching a squat, a split squat, a deadlift variation, whatever it is, I'm thinking of each guy, what their feet look like, tibia shapes, and what's that looks like when they hit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm actually trying to coach and see in the exercise. Like I'm trying to fix or create this turn and this shape in their turn as a right-handed hitter. Then I want to see kind of this presentation in the split squat.
Yeah,
You know?
no. And then I was going to point that out, that one of the ways you kind of touched on, like, okay, you put these people in the buckets, but one thing I know that you do, and where the individualization to like that deeper degree, I know comes from you too as well, is that you'll make a slight variation in that same lift, like you said,
Yeah.
right? Like I'll
Yeah.
put pads, I'll put a
Mhm.
ball between their knees, I'll
Yeah.
I'll raise one, foot slightly, I'll do some of the, and that's where I think for you, it's like, okay, yeah, just like us, like we'll have these bucketing, like, yeah, you're not a unicorn, right? Like you can
Yeah.
do some things that are good
Huh?
for both, but at the same time, for you, you might need a slight variation
Yeah.
that would be big for you in that lift
Hmm.
comparatively to somebody else. And so, because I know a strength coach might be listening and going, how do I program, for this many people?
Yeah.
Like, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, go ahead. I'll
You
let you.
freaking can. Like, we got 47 guys on our roster right now.
Yeah.
It's like I do individual stuff and they got their own little movement sheet and stuff like that. But like when
Yeah.
you're trying to throw or flow 20, 25 guys through and our facility, we got other teams in there as well too. It's like, you find these little variations, stuff like that are gonna help push the needle and do those types of things. But you'd be surprised how far that could take you. And it's like the pro orgs too. It's like so it's usually two kind of contradicting ideas is scaling and individualization,
Mm.
right? Like if I have all individualization, then I have a hard time scaling it across like up and down an org. Or for me, like, we have baseball, softball, track, golf, soccer's,
Yeah.
volleyball, a million teams training there. It's like we have to scale it,
Yeah.
but within the scaling, we kind of have some framework and we try to develop the skill set.
Yeah.
So then you can, instead of this rigid system, it's practitioners build the skill set and the lens to see with their own eyes and understanding that they can sprinkle the individualization within the scaling of a system.
100%. I think that I always say the structure is what brings you freedom, if you
Yeah,
have the
yeah.
structure, then you can just make these small little variations. And that's why I wanted to bring up for strength coaches, because I hear coaches and even hitting coaches, right? It's like, man, I got all these hitters, we only have, I only got one cage on, on the side of the field, and here, like, how do I individualize for all these different players? Like, no, like they could be doing different things. And like in the weight room, we take their programming that they do from school, and then we say, hey, stagger your feet on this one. You know what I'm saying? Or go to, the slight variation. Instead, all I want you to do is, use a dumbbell, or, or something,
Mhm.
or like only on the, just these slight things, because we don't want them to also come off as like not part of the team, right? And like doing their
Yeah,
own completely
yeah,
different things and like disrespecting the coach
yeah,
from that side. It's just like, no, let's look at your programming that you already have. Maybe we'll add a couple like accessory things that we would recommend or something like that, but you can do those outside, right? Like not during your lift time, or maybe additional time. But then, like I said, like we'll try to just give them little things. And half the time when we give them these little slight variations, their strength coaches either don't say anything or don't even notice, because there's such little slight
yeah,
small changes to the programming that they're already doing.
yeah,
So that's one thing that we've learned to do with, again, obviously we're not in control of all of our strength for all of our hitters across the
For
country,
sure.
right? They all have different programs, different philosophies between different programs, all that stuff. And so sometimes we try to just work within the framework that they, have already been given, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be good. Yeah. And then I definitely, Rick, I appreciate you jumping on. I know there's so many layers. Look, I've been talking to Rick for every time I talk to Rick, I learn new stuff. So we could always, talk a ton, and I'm sure we'll definitely have to dive into deeper, maybe some different ones on some different common patterns that we see,
Yeah.
or common adaptations that we see within the sport, and some other things that we could definitely get into at a different time. I'd love to do that too as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, Rick, if people, why don't you drop, if you, I feel like you're a guy that might not know your ad on Twitter. Do you know?
I think it's Franzblau at Franzblau Rick. I
He said,
didn't
I
do it
think
for, I took like a 2-year hiatus, then I did a little bit during the summer, and it looks like I'm probably on another long hiatus. But
But it's good. It's good for you them
yeah,
to go back through and dig through some of these things and get a
yeah.
visual on some of the stuff that you're talking about. And then also to some of the resources I know you pointed me towards. What were some things you would say for some people to look into that they can kind of start walking down this path of understanding these things from a little bit deeper lens?
Yeah, I think it all kind of goes back to Bill. He's the genius that kind of put this model together. So Bill has his own network now, UHP network. So there's a free section, and then there's also a paid section. So that's not just a plug and trying to hype up a friend or mentor, but like I've done every system and model possible, and this was absolutely game changing for me. Because the other thing it does, it's providing the lens for you to see things that stuff you've done before doesn't become obsolete. You
Yeah.
just maybe have a better understanding of when and how to implement it, which is the cool thing,
Yeah.
So I can't recommend people enough to kind of to dive into that if you need some help with it. Um, my consulting cup is pretty full, but with the right opportunity, maybe I could fit one or two more in there. But that's where I just kind of helped some people in terms of interpreting, using the model in baseball settings and things like that.
Yeah. No, awesome. No, I really appreciate you jumping on, Rick. I don't know how we haven't done a podcast at this point, but we got it done. We got it done,
It was
man.
fun. It was fun. Appreciate you having me, Joey.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right, man. Well, I'm sure we'll do another one here soon, but appreciate the time that you gave us today.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Good stuff.